Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm Dr. David Pendergrass. In this podcast, I want to play for you a recording of a discipleship lesson I gave for the people at First Methodist Church, Houston. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, in today's discipleship lesson, I want to continue in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Particularly, I want to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48. 5:38 to 48. In this section, Jesus talks about what to do when someone's hurt us or shamed us. And people often ask the question, is it okay, is it moral for Christians to fight back? In today's text, we're going to talk about that. We're going to look at that particularly. In verse 38, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Of course, they would have heard this in the synagogue on Shabbat, on Saturdays, and they heard this because of Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, says this kind of thing, to eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. This kind of code, the law, the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is typically called the lex talionis, the law of retaliation in Latin. And in general, scholars agree that the law of retaliation, this lex talionis, was common in the ancient world. We know that for a fact because it shows up in numerous law codes, the Hammurabi law codes and so forth, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon, and so forth. But most scholars agree that the reason why this code was enacted was to limit the amount of payback. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, meaning it was not, whole body for eye, your whole family for a tooth. What happened was when someone was hurt, blood feuds would enact, and so families and tribes and villages would go get them. So if it found out that little Susie was raped, she might go get all of her brothers and kinfolk and go murder all the family. And so it was a blood feud. This had happened. To this day, in many parts of the world, but certainly in the Middle East, this goes on for generation. And they haven't experienced something bad, but they'll say, that same family hurt my family. The law of retaliation, ideally, limited the amount of punishment done. So it's already good in itself. That's good that you're saying eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But Jesus is saying, and I say to you, not but I say to you. It's not a strong but in the Greek. It's just, and I say to you, do not oppose or resist the evil one. And I say, don't oppose or resist the evil one. Now, this is where Jesus seems to go a little different from what the text says. Other times he seems to just be interpreting what the text says. Here he seems to be going even much farther. And I'm saying, don't even resist or oppose the evil one. So if they take an eye, you don't take an eye. You don't even take an eye. If they take a tooth, you don't go to take a tooth. You don't take anything. And that's what's so amazing. Now, Jesus is not novel. Other people at the time, other ancient authorities, also argued that you should not enact in kind. For example, it's all through Proverbs 20:22, 24:29, other ancient authors and so forth. But let me say a few things about what Jesus is not saying. Jesus is not speaking of never resisting evil in general. In Greek, it's do not resist the evil one. He's not saying don't resist bad people in general ever. Secondly, he's not saying here are some governmental policies that nations should put in place. These are not about government policies. And third, this is not about stopping an evil one who's hurting someone else. He didn't say don't resist the evil one who's hurting someone else, or at every time, or government shouldn't do it. Here, Jesus has one particular thing in mind. That is personal opposition from a person who is acting as your evil one, as your enemy. What do we do when someone acts as our enemy toward us? Now, I'm not suggesting that we cannot extrapolate from that principle or his point about someone opposing us and apply that to all kinds of other situations. It's just that when we do that, we have to be careful and we have to take the whole biblical witness into account, not just one saying. Because in context, Jesus is specifically talking about when the one person acts as our enemy one-on-one, as it were. And then he gives 4 examples of how to apply what he just said in verse 39. He gives 4 examples. And those examples, again, these are 4 examples of what it might look like of how you would respond to an evil one or enemy by not opposing them, by not resisting them. If you're not opposing, not resisting, what are you doing in good Jesus language? You're loving them. So he gives 4 examples, really, of how to demonstrate love toward an enemy instead of opposition. How to demonstrate love towards someone instead of opposition. Now, later on in the text, Jesus is going to say specifically in 5:43 to 48 that we're supposed to love our enemies, do good to those who persecute us. So in context, from 538 all the way down to 48, this whole section is about Jesus showing us, giving examples of how disciples of Jesus, citizens of the kingdom of God, how we treat people who oppose us, how we love them. So these are examples how not to rip out their tooth if they get our tooth and so forth. Now, let me say a quick word before we go to those exact examples. In the ancient world, and it's still true in much of the Mediterranean world today, it was certainly true in the ancient world, cultures didn't work by issues of sin and righteousness. They worked by issues of honor and shame. Honor and shame. We have a modern analogy to that, and that is etiquette. It's etiquette. So it's shameful in a Southern American culture if you want to come over and hang out at my house, if I block you out. That is to say, hospitality is a virtue and etiquette, as it were. And it's certainly a virtue in different places in the Bible. But in the South, that's the case. Other parts of the world, it's not as strong as a virtue. Other things that are not even closely derived from the Bible is you can't run in a church building. You can't run in a church building. That's nowhere in the Bible at all. A church building didn't exist until the 4th and early 5th century. But that's etiquette. And so if you don't run in church, and I remember when I was a kid, old people just yell at me, "Don't you dare run in church. Didn't you realize where you are?" And so I would be shamed by that. Why? Because etiquette. It's not because it's a virtue, it's just because etiquette. Well, that's how people in the ancient world worked all the time. So you wanted to build up honor, build up glory, and you wanted to diminish shame. And so they thought of decisions not in so much of terms as, is this right or wrong? They thought in terms of what brings honor and what brings shame. And honor and shame are fluid terms, like water that you can fill up. You can gain it or lose it. Well, Jews, of course, did think in right and wrong, whether it was of God's law or not God's law. So Jews thought that way, but Jews also thought in terms of honor and shame. Now that's important because all the examples Jesus gives are shaming events. They're shaming. They're not necessarily sinful. They're not breaking a law of the Old Testament necessarily, but they are shameful. And in being shaming, they act as the person's enemy. For example, in verse 39, when he says to strike on the right cheek, the person who says if someone strikes on the right cheek, you turn them the other one. Now the assumption is probably that a right-handed person has hit you on the right cheek, which means he struck you backhandedly. So that is that he backhanded you, which is a shameful thing. So Jesus is talking about when a person shames you, not when they punch you to injure. So it's a shaming thing. Therefore, to turn the other cheek means not to retaliate violently. So you turn the other one means I'm not going to punch you back. It means you just turn the other one freely. You offer the other cheek freely and not as a person who is inferior, shamed person. You offer it freely and not as an inferior, shamed person. Now, you offer the other cheek, it demonstrates your love. That is, you're driven by love, not by retaliation. Because our first instinct is a punch back. But he says, nope, your shame's not going to get me on this one. Secondly, what about this idea of a poor person gets sued in their tunic? And he says, if someone sues you for that, you give them the other one. The idea is that, in general, Middle Eastern people, and they still do, most of them, wear two major kinds of garments. You have the outer garment and then the inner garment. The inner garment is typically called a tunic. It's the inner side. It's like a nightgown that's underneath the outer garment. Now, the idea is if you're sued for your inner garment, and you're sued for that, which means you don't have any other material. You can't be sued for a donkey, sued for a crop, sued for money. The point is, if the only thing I can get out of you when I sue you is your tunic, it's like saying I'm suing you for your underwear, which means the person's broke, they're poor, they're low in society. So, now, of course, in Judaism, in Exodus 22:26 and Deuteronomy 24:13, you're not supposed to sue a poor person for the tunic. So that would be breaking the law anyway, the moral law for Jews. But the idea is that if a disciple gives the rest of his clothing, he does so freely. So it's shaming for a person to sue a poor person with their underwear. But Jesus says, look, if they sue you for that, give them everything. Just give them everything. It could be the case that if they give them everything, they go naked and it shames the other person. Like, how dare you sue a poor person? That could be the case. If that's the case, then I figure Jesus would say more about that. But it seems to be the case he's saying, don't react violently and retaliate. You freely give them everything you got to demonstrate, I don't hate you, my enemy. To demonstrate, I don't hate you. And the third thing that Jesus says, his third analogy of how to not show opposition toward an evil one or an enemy, is in verse 41. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now what is Jesus talking about there? Almost certainly Jesus is talking about a Roman soldier's prerogative to dump his baggage on a other person. Remember that in the first century Palestine, everybody was aware, every non-Roman was aware, that they were not free. They were daily reminded that they were not free. Imagine if during World War II you interviewed people in France and so forth, people around the world when the Nazis took over. They're always reminded, you go outside and you would see people in different uniforms with armed weapons, and they're ready to go, and you're always aware that a military has conquered your country. Well, that's how it was for Jesus and all of his people. And so when a Roman came around, they said, hey, take this baggage, take this Roman cross, as they did for Simon the Cyrene in chapter 27, verse 32, when Jesus was going to Golgotha. They forced this random person, Simon, to help carry the cross. So if he forces you, verse 41, to go a mile, he says, go a second mile. Saying that. Of course, experiencing the fact that a Roman could force that upon you is a shaming act. Jesus says, you want to respond not by retaliation, but by kind and by lovingness to say, all right, I'll go a second mile. It demonstrates that you're doing this, just like the other examples, you're doing so freely and not as a shamed, inferior person. You're much more like a friend who wants to help his friend carry his load. It's a way to demonstrate non-violence, non-retaliation to someone who's opposed you, someone an enemy, someone who has shamed you. What about this last example? The last example seems a bit bizarre from the others, but it probably does fit quite well in verse 32. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you. Now, does that mean every single time someone begs us of things we have to give it to them? Probably not. Jesus is probably referencing Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. If we read Deuteronomy 15, 7 to 11, it talks about how we should give to those who need and the poor and so forth. And the point is, we give so, as it says in Deuteronomy, generously, not begrudgingly. The point is, we should give to people without harboring resentment toward them because we have to give to them, but rather we do it generously and kindly. And in context, Jesus is probably saying something like, disciples, don't not lend to a person who is your enemy. Don't show power or retaliation or hatred or opposition towards your enemy by not helping him or her when they need help. Don't say, forget you. No, what you've done to me, no, I'm not helping you at all. Jesus almost certainly is telling his disciples, that's us. You don't act that way. When someone has legitimate need, you do your best to help and give it to them. So, again, you lend to your enemy to demonstrate that you are driven by love, not by opposition of your hatred of your enemy. You give freely. You give freely and kindly and out of love. And in verses 42 to 48, he continues on and says, again, loving your enemies and caring for those who do good for you. We see in all these examples something really incredible, and that is that Jesus says, disciples, citizens of the kingdom of God, you're not like everybody else. You're not like the ways of the world, which is ruled by evil. You're of the ways of God. God the Father doesn't behave that way towards you. If he only opposed the enemies, of which we can be, and many of us were enemies of God, if God responded to us like that, we'd all be dead. Instead, he acts lovingly toward us. And by loving, it means he does good for them. It doesn't mean he feels warm, fuzzy feelings or that we have to like our enemies and go, I want to be their friend. Nope, that has nothing to do with it. This means, instead, doing good to them. And that's what loving neighbor means, do good to them. I do good for me. I take care of my own needs. I feed me and give myself fresh water and rest and shelter. Jesus says that's what we do to other people, including your enemies. However bizarre that sounds, in a modern culture or in any kind of culture, disciples, this is the challenge of our King who says, you are not to act like them in return. It is not eye for an eye. It's not eye, or it's not get more than you got to get to show them who's boss or payback. Payback is not a Christian virtue. Payback is not what a citizen of the kingdom of God does. Payback is from God. Let God handle the consequences of a person's behavior, and we'll get busy loving. Thank you so much for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. If you want to listen to more, go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and look at one of the tabs that says podcast. If you click that, it'll take you straight to my podcast on iTunes, or you can search for it on iTunes if you want to, A Glimpse of the Kingdom. But also on my website, you'll see another way to get, if you're an Android listener on your phone or you just don't use Mac computers, again, davidpendergrass.com, and click podcast. It'll take you exactly where you need to go, and you can subscribe from there and get this as often as you like, and also see my blogs and so forth. If you want to get me to come to your organization or church, otherwise to do some consulting, you need to go to davidpendergrassconsulting.com, You'll see the information there. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, you can find me at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass.